A commenter on another video asked me what I think of Dr. Mary Enig, so I decided it was necessary to share what I found several months ago. Mary Enig has a PhD in nutritional sciences from the University of Maryland, College Park, so clearly she is far more qualified to dispense nutritional advice than is Sally Fallon. Indeed, that seems to be the arrangement between the two founders of the Weston Price Foundation. Enig's job is to do the science, while Fallon explains her pontifications to the masses. So Enig is responsible for the scientific misinformation coming out of this organization, but Fallon is responsible for spreading it far and wide in order to make herself rich. So it's a hard call determining who is more reproachable. Anyway, let's demonstrate that Enig is no less inclined to twist the truth than is Fallon, which you will know if you've watched my previous videos, especially on Nathan Pritikin. This article on the Weston Price Foundation website, The Skinny on Fats, was posted in January of 2000 and authored by Enig and Fallon. As always, my approach is to test individual claims made by the WAPF people and see if I can detect a pattern of dishonesty. So we're going to examine one paragraph from this article. It's going to be this section here entitled "The Evidence Supporting the Lipid Hypothesis." And it's a fairly long section, so we're just going to be taking the last paragraph in that section. Let me go ahead and read that to you in full, and then I'll come back and make commentary on it. The Lipid Research Clinic's Coronary Primary Prevention Trial, LRC-CPPT, which cost $150 million, is the study most often cited by the experts. You guys, actually, I'm just going to keep my cursor. If you want to read this yourself, then go ahead. I'm not going to make you dizzy by moving my screen back and forth here. It is the study most often cited by the experts to justify low-fat diets. Actually, dietary cholesterol and saturated fat were not tested in this study, as all subjects were given a low cholesterol, low saturated fat diet. Instead, the study tested the effects of a cholesterol-lowering drug. Their statistical analysis of the results implied a 24% reduction in the rate of coronary heart disease in the group taking the drug compared with the placebo group. However, non-heart disease deaths in the group increased, deaths from cancer, stroke, violence, and suicide. Even the conclusion that lowering cholesterol reduces heart disease is suspect. Independent researchers who tabulated the results of this study found no significant statistical difference in coronary heart disease death rates between the two groups. However, both the popular press and medical journals touted the LRC-CPPT as the long-sought proof that animal fats are the cause of heart disease, America's #1 killer. So, a couple comments here before we really jump into it. Just to give you an idea of the poor writing skills, or poor logic, reasoning skills of Enig and Fallon, saying, actually, dietary cholesterol and saturated fat were not tested in this study, as all subjects were given a low cholesterol, low saturated fat diet. Haven't you completely contradicted yourself by saying that? What they meant to say, I believe, was that they were not giving a low cholesterol, low saturated fat diet, but were just giving a cholesterol lowering drug. You always have to be on the lookout for how they, how they twist their information. A good example comes in the fourth sentence of the same paragraph. Their statistical analysis of the results implied a 24% reduction in the rate of coronary heart disease. Statistical data doesn't imply anything. The study stated in plain black and white that there was a 24% reduction in the rate of coronary heart disease between the two groups tested. But WAPF uses language like this all the time in order to condition its readers to disbelieve plain facts. Okay, if you want to be honest in your objection, just say, this is what the results of the study said. But non-heart disease death in the group did increase. They do go on to say that in their... They go on to say here, however, non-heart disease deaths in the drug group increased. Deaths from cancer, stroke, violence, suicide. No reason to use the word implied. You can simply say, this is what the study said, however, it also said this. So why the need for the word implied there? If you think I'm being overly critical here, I'm not. This is a matter of how you're supposed to use the English language, okay? And not using it properly or accurately, and especially when there's a pattern detected of doing that, it implies that you're being less than honest and you're manipulating your readers. There's no need for the mind-controlled double talk, but double talk is what Enig and Fallon engage in all the time, which really ought to clue you into their credibility and the validity of their claims. Now, the main sentence I want to examine in this paragraph is this one. Independent researchers who tabulated the results of this study found no significant statistical difference in coronary heart disease death rates between the two groups. Now, ask yourself what this image evokes in your mind. I'm going to go ahead and explain my thought process the first time, and in fact, the first 5 times that I read that sentence, at least. To me, what they were saying in paraphrase was, these independent researchers whipped out their calculators, crunched the numbers from this study all over again, and actually found that there was no difference in death rates between the two groups. Now, maybe that's just me. Maybe you can fault me for not reading carefully enough or not being well educated in the terminology of statistics and scientific research. I think that's a fair accusation. However, you need to keep in mind that that same mindset precisely describes the majority of the readers for WAPF. WAPF members and followers are entirely average, if not below average, in their grasp of scientific concepts. So when you use a word like tabulate, what that is going to mean to most people is they recalculated the data all on their own. And in fact, if you look at the definition of tabulate, as we'll do now quickly on Merriam-Webster, it says the second definition that they offer for that is to count, record, or list systematically. I'll leave it to you whether the implication of using that word in this sentence, like Enig and Fallon do, evokes the image that I just described. Again, maybe it's just me, but whoever these independent researchers are, the implication is that they somehow crunched these numbers all over again. So let's find out who these independent researchers, actually independent researcher, because there was only one of them as opposed to some fleet of Denise Mingers debunking every established scientific hypothesis from their dorm rooms, what this guy's conclusion was. Okay? So you can see here, this is the reference that's listed. This is a letter from Richard Cronmell to the Journal of the American Medical Association. This letter was later replied to by the authors of the original study. You can only find a few lines of each letter online, but I do have PDFs of each, so I will be reading from those. If you want the proof and really want to see it for yourself, send me a message and I'll send you the files. Anyway, let's start with Cronmell's letter, which kicked this whole thing off. So here you can see the citation in the PDF. Let's start out by looking at this. Note what he says here in the very first paragraph of the letter. The trial was well designed and superbly carried out. That's not exactly the tone you'd expect from someone who's about to lay waste to all of its conclusions. But let's get on into the gist of Cronmall's criticism. It starts in the second paragraph. My own summary of the outcome of the LRC-CPPT and its justifiable conclusions is as follows. The primary endpoint of the LRC-CPPT clinical trial was definite non-fatal myocardial infarction and/or death related to CHD. The life table determined event rate for the primary endpoint at 7 years of follow-up was 7% in the cholestyramine group and 8.6% in the placebo group, a difference of 1.6 percentage points. This difference does not reach statistical significance at the 0.01 one-sided test level. However, this difference is significant at the 0.05 level with a one-sided test. He then goes on to state on page 2, the emphasis on the 0.01 and 0.05 one-sided significance tests in my summary may seem unduly technical. The usual standard for reporting statistically significant results is based on a 0.05 two-sided test of significance. The importance of the distinction between the one-sided and two-sided testing is that a much smaller relative difference between the two groups will be deemed statistically significant on the basis of a one-sided than a two-sided test. The designers of the CPPT clearly recognized this fact in the article describing the design of the study, which was written obviously several years before the study was actually conducted. They indicated that since the time, magnitude, and cost of this study make it unlikely that it could ever be repeated, it was essential to be sure that any observed benefit of total cholesterol lowering was a real one. Therefore, alpha was set to 0.01 rather than the usual 0.05. Thus, in the design of the CPPT, it was felt that a difference larger than one that would provide statistical significance at the one-sided 0.05 level was necessary for a convincing demonstration of the beneficial effect of the cholestyramine treatment. However, sometime between the design and the reporting of the results of the trial, the criteria that had been set up originally were changed and a 0.05 one-sided test was deemed to be satisfactory. This change was not discussed in the two publications in the journal. The use of the one-sided 0.05 level test results in a lowering of the standard of the evidence required to judge whether the outcome of a clinical trial justifies rejecting the null hypothesis of no difference between the treatment and null groups. Had the authors used the 0.01 one-sided test or the usual 0.05 two-sided test, they would have been unable to reject the null hypothesis of no difference between the cholestyramine group and the placebo group. So you see here that Cronmall's criticism is not because he exposed fraud on the part of the researchers, as Enig and Fallon are clearly hoping we will infer from their vague reference. Instead, he is arguing that the results are not statistically significant and therefore should not be relied upon to support the assertion that lowered plasma cholesterol levels lead to lower incidence of cardiovascular disease. Already you should be seeing that this argument is far more technical than Enig and Fallon would lead you to believe. So now let's see how the researchers respond to Cronmall. This is the PDF of their response. I'm going to be reading several paragraphs of their response, so forgive me if this seems ad nauseum and goes on at length, but I believe it is critical to address this point. I will say this at the outset, though. The point this response is going to make should make it clear that unless you, as a layperson, I mean, this is my opinion, obviously, but please give it some thought. Unless you as a layperson are willing to roll up your sleeves and gain an understanding of statistics and evaluate the merits of Cronmall's arguments regarding statistical significance versus the arguments of the original researchers, then maybe you really ought to leave it up to the scientific community at large to determine who's right and who's wrong, as opposed to, you just shooting from the hip and deciding yourself, or taking the advice of Enig and Fallon, who clearly have an agenda. Uh, who's right and who's wrong in this issue has clearly been decided, and no, it's not a matter of some conspiracy on the part of the medical establishment to kill you by telling you to avoid cholesterol when you actually need it to be healthy. Anyway, let's read from the study, the reply rather. With regard to the issue of significance, meaning statistical significance, Dr. Cronmall does not dispute that a reduction in the combined incidence of coronary heart disease, CHD death, and myocardial infarction at least as great as that observed in the LRC-CPPT would have arisen by chance alone in less than one experiment out of 20, i.e. p less than 0.05. In other words, Cronmall agrees with their conclusions. He's not disputing the accuracy of their data, as opposed to what WAPF would have you believe. However, he criticizes our use of the conventional p equals 0.05 cut point in describing this result as statistically significant. He argues that the use of a one-sided probability level obliged us to use a more stringent criterion for significance. Citing our published recruitment goal of a sample sufficiently large to yield a highly significant p less than 0.01 outcome in 9 of 10 experiments, given certain projections of plasma blah blah blah, he further argues that only an outcome with p less than 0.01 should have been considered significant, and surmises that our criterion for significance changed after the fact. In our opinion, these arguments are fallacious. The sightedness of the statistical test was determined by the sightedness of the hypothesis stated a priori. The choice of a threshold probability for significance is a completely separate issue. None was specified in the LRC-CPPT hypothesis. The statement from the LRC-CPPT design article cited by Dr. Cronmall was made specifically in reference to the calculation of sample size. The projections used to set the study's recruitment goals in 1973 were neither presented nor intended as declarations in advance of the criteria by which the study outcome must be judged. The one-sided hypothesis that was stated in 1973 was exactly the hypothesis that was tested in 1984. Statistical theory tells us how to evaluate in probabilistic terms the consistency of an experimental outcome with an a priori hypothesis, but does not provide a probability level at which that outcome passes from uncertainty to certainty. Thresholds for significance are convenient but arbitrary conventions intended to facilitate the practical interpretation of scientific results, not objective statistical standards for proving a hypothesis true or false. This should be common sense. The opinion of the LRC investigators when they were planning the CPPT that a highly significant p less than 0.01 outcome would be desirable for ensuring greater credibility, an opinion that influenced the choice of alpha in their sample size calculations, may or may not have been justified in 1973, but it is not relevant to the issue at hand. The LRC-CPPT results would be no more convincing had alpha been set at 0.1 in these preliminary calculations. They would be no less convincing had alpha been set at 0.001. In other words, what happens 11 years prior to the publication of the results of the actual study should not factor into the evaluation of whether those results are statistically significant and therefore should be have some impact on how people actually live their lives. Assessing the validity of even a highly significant result is a complex scientific judgment. In other words, not something that lay people should be engaged in, much less somebody who's got a big agenda to push, which requires a full evaluation of the best and most current evidence available from all relevant sources, including but not limited to p-values. The impressive internal consistency of the LRC CPPT results and their consistency with the results of other studies, several published after 1973, were discussed at length in the original publications. This consistency was an important consideration when we concluded that the study's outcome, which was statistically significant at the 0.05 but not the 0.01 level of probability, provided persuasive evidence that lowering plasma cholesterol levels reduced the risk of CHD. When the term significant was used, explicit test statistics and criteria were provided. Thus, it was and is a simple matter for the reader to judge significance by criteria of his own choosing. But then you'd have to actually read the studies yourself instead of getting a one-sentence synopsis of it from an agenda-driven group. Moreover, the information that the observed reductions in plasma cholesterol and CHD incidence in the cholestyramine resin-treated group were each only about half as great as those assumed in the sample size computation was provided explicitly. Although there is no logical reason that the failure to meet a preliminary projection should be grounds for discounting a result that would otherwise be considered persuasive, the relevant data were not withheld from the reader. Ultimately, it is the reader who must weigh the evidence. And again, I'm pretty sure that when they say the reader here, they're assuming that you are a reader with scientific background and therefore judgment to decide these matters. I mean, you've got a guy like Cronmall who's raising questionable arguments. But I mean, imagine somebody who doesn't even have a housewife sitting at home in her armchair saying, "Oh yeah, clearly Enig and Fallon are right. These guys are obviously full of crap." Like you have any ability to make that kind of judgment. But nevertheless, you're going to decide what to feed yourself and your family on the basis of your complete lack of judgment and discernment. So well done, good job. Way to kill yourself. Anyway, I hope that makes it clear enough just how untrustworthy Enig and Fallon are. Look at how much time and energy it takes to obtain a very rudimentary understanding of a complex issue just to be introduced to it. How much time it has taken. Which Enig and Fallon merely summarize in one line to support their viewpoint, fully expecting you will just trust them and be far too daunted or busy to undertake to understand this issue yourself. So again, I would suggest that until you have equipped yourself with the tools to sincerely challenge the findings of the medical establishment with regards to dietary cholesterol and saturated fat, you might give a little more regard to their findings. Or at the very least, you might apply the same amount of skepticism to Enig and Fallon, the people with an agenda to push, that you do to the targets of their vitriol.